Peacemaker Season 2. Yeah, I'm actually really excited for Peacemaker Season 2. Before making this video, I pretty much binge watched all of Season 1, and I really enjoyed it. You know, it's very like dark and violent and, you know, very adult, but I think overall it was like really entertaining. You know, I love the characters. I love the character of Peacemaker, Christopher Smith, played by John Cena. I thought he was really cool, and I thought he had a really cool arc in the story. You know, he was kind of like the joke character in The Suicide Squad. He was like, I'm going to make peace by any means possible, no matter how many men, women, and children have to kill in order to get it. So, you know, it's kind of like this joke anti-version of Captain America kind of in a way, and they kind of embraced that. So I think that was really fun. But yeah, they kind of really like humanized his character. You know, they gave him a lot of backstory. You know, they showed his life before he joined Task Force X and his father and, you know, his brother and everything, and how his father was just this horrible neo-Nazi guy who kind of pitted these two boys together, and, you know, how like they would just have these kind of like fights and everything like that, you know, and people would bet money, and then how Peacemaker accidentally killed his brother in the fight, and how he felt all that guilt and shame, and especially, you know, all that stuff that his father brought onto him, and that kind of made him who he is, and that, you know, he's always had this mission to bring peace to whatever situation he's in. And then obviously that got twisted by, you know, his father's manipulation, and how, you know, that caused him to, you know, become just a mass murderer in a way, you know, in order to embrace peace. And then obviously, you know, he got recruited by Waller and then brought into Project Starfish, and then we got everything that happened in The Suicide Squad, and, you know, that kind of sent him kind of reeling, like, who am I? What do I do? What's my identity? And this show kind of like helps him embrace who he is, kind of like gives him a new mission in life, is, you know, to protect others, you know, obviously protect the world from this alien threat that happens with Project Butterfly and all these different like butterfly alien creatures, you know, taking over these people's bodies and everything, in order to have this different mission and everything like that, in order to change society and have it kind of conform to their ways, because they see that human beings are just super flawed, which, you know, totally we are, and they think that their ways are best for us to control us and have us be, you know, a better society. And, you know, how Peacemaker kind of sees past that and, you know, kind of brings an end to it. Spoilers for everything for Peacemaker Season 1 if you haven't seen it. Again, watch it on Max. Come back and watch this, you know, by destroying the giant cow monster and destroying their sap supply. But yeah, I like how it kind of ended kind of ambiguously, like, oh, Peacemaker, did he make the right decision in killing the cow and bringing an end to Project Butterfly? But I think it's a really good ending to that story arc, and then kind of sets us up for what could possibly happen in Season 2. You know, now he's part of this new team with Adebayo and Economos and Harcourt, and obviously with Waller and Vigilante, which I thought was a really fun character too. It kind of reminded me of Deadpool, how he's kind of like this snarky character, and he's always like super sarcastic, but he doesn't really know social cues at all. But yeah, I really liked all the characters, really liked the storyline, and it really kind of set us up for what could happen in this new DCU. And back in February 2022, the second season was announced, and James Gunn was announced to write and direct all the episodes. And then in February 2023, he said that work would continue after Waller was made, since Superman was going to be his next project. And then in that October, James Gunn said that the new season of Peacemaker would take place within the new DCU continuity. But then in March of 2024, James Gunn said that Waller had been delayed because of the 2023 writers and actors strikes, and that this season of Peacemaker would actually be produced first. And then filming finally began later in 2024 after all the strikes had ended. But that was also the time that he was directing Superman, so he wasn't able to direct all the episodes, so he had to kind of give some of the episodes away to other directors so that he can focus more on Superman, which totally makes sense, since Superman is kind of like the big project that kind of sets up the entire DCU, so you kind of have to put more focus on that in order to make it good before working on any other projects. And they also had a pre-shoot in April of 2024 ahead of principal photography, which started in June of 2024 and then concluded in November of 2024. And that in the continuity is supposed to take place after Creature Commandos and Superman, which totally makes sense for the release order, so we don't really have to worry about things kind of being out of timeline order. We can just have the TV shows and movies come out, and we can just follow the continuity that way. Also, Frank Grillo is confirmed to return for this season of Peacemaker, which will be interesting to see how he interacts with Peacemaker, especially since Peacemaker is responsible for the death of his son. So it'll be interesting to see how those two characters interact, and hopefully by this point Peacemaker would be kind of more apologetic for his previous actions, and hopefully he'll be more humble towards Rick Flag Sr. and try to ask for his forgiveness, and hopefully the two will finally, you know, form a bond. I'm sure like there'll be conflict earlier in the season, and then as the show goes on, they'll learn to trust each other and then face whatever threat they're going to be facing in the new season. But overall, yeah, I'm really excited for Peacemaker Season 2. Like, I was definitely not expecting to enjoy Peacemaker Season 1 as much as I did, and it'd be interesting to see how Season 2 kind of factors into this new DCU continuity, because it didn't really have too much to do with the DCEU. I know there was kind of like references here and there to like characters and events, but James Gunn was saying that there's supposed to be kind of like a rough memory of what happened in the DCEU, but it's really just going to be like its own new story, which totally makes sense because again, there wasn't really too many things from the larger DCEU that could kind of impede on this new version of the DCU. So I'm sure James Gunn will have his own separate story, and we'll see how it kind of connects to the overall DCU and how it kind of sets up events for future threats that the heroes will be facing later on. And we actually have a bunch of updates for Peacemaker Season 2. Back in June of 2024, Sol Rodriguez was cast as the character of Sasha Bordeaux, Tim Meadows was casted as Langston Fleury, an Argus agent, and Newt Lee was confirmed to be reprising his role as Judo Master from the first season, while David Denman was casted in an undisclosed role. And also back in November of 2024, Anissa Matlock, Taylor St. Clair, Dorian Kingi, and Brandon Stanley were cast in undisclosed roles. So it's going to be interesting to see what roles these characters play within Season 2, especially the ones whose characters have been confirmed for the season. I'm not really too familiar with Sasha Bordeaux, but just by doing research, I know she's a character affiliated with Batman, so maybe she'll serve as some kind of setup for the DCU's version of Batman, but we'll see how that goes. And as far as Langston Fleury, I don't really know too much about him, but just seeing how Tim Meadows portrays him in the trailer, looks like he's definitely going to be kind of like that no-nonsense new director of Argus, and how he doesn't really care about his crew, he's just kind of like insulting them and giving them kind of like derogatory nicknames and everything, but he definitely looks like he's going to like get the job done and kind of be more of like a comedic character, but also take himself way too seriously, so it's going to be interesting seeing that. And seeing Judo Master there again is going to be really fun. I really liked his character in the first season, and it's definitely going to be interesting what his arc's going to be in this season. Is he still going to be an enemy? Is he eventually going to join the Peacemaker team? Or is he just going to like fight for himself? So we'll see what happens when Season 2 comes out. And then back in February of this year, James Gunn said that he enjoyed evolving the character of Rick Flag Sr. in the DC universe from his introduction as a protagonist in the animated series Creature Commandos. So I think that's going to be really interesting, especially the fact that he's now going to be confronting the character of Peacemaker after Peacemaker killed his son Rick Flag Jr. in the Suicide Squad movie. So it's definitely going to be interesting what kind of dynamic that brings. He also said that this season was more about Christopher Smith, referring to Peacemaker's real name, and the interconnectivity between the characters and their personal lives, which we definitely see more of in the trailer, especially with the fact that Peacemaker wanting to join the Justice League and kind of going to that warehouse for an interview and interviewing with Maxwell Lord and Hawkgirl and Guy Gardner, and how they switch off the microphone and they're kind of like insulting Peacemaker, and Peacemaker is like, wait, I can hear you guys, is this supposed to be how the interview goes? And them kind of rejecting him and everything. So yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how Peacemaker, Adebayo and Economos and Harcourt and Vigilante kind of like deal with their personal lives. You kind of see each one of them dealing with some kind of issue, like Adebayo dealing with like her wife and everything, and like how this job is kind of coming between them, and how no one kind of takes the rest of the team seriously. Harcourt is going through that therapy session where she suffers from toxic masculinity, and she's like, what? And then this scene where like Economos is visiting Adebayo, at the motel, and then he's like, we're the worst level of Grand Theft Auto there is. So I think that was interesting. And then of course Vigilante feeling like, why doesn't anybody respect us? Nobody likes us, nobody cares about us. So it's going to be interesting seeing where the characters are at the beginning of this season and how they kind of gradually evolve into the larger DCU, and what kind of trials and tribulations they're gonna have to go through in order to earn respect of like the Justice League, and eventually become members of this whole DC universe and everything. So I'm definitely excited to see kind of like what they go through and how kind of like the group Argus is kind of like going after them and everything. So yeah, definitely be interesting for sure. And then back in May of this year, we got a brand new trailer revealing John Cena also portraying another version of Peacemaker, who appears from an alternate universe within the DC multiverse. So that'd be interesting. I've heard rumors that the other version of Peacemaker is actually from the DCEU, and now he's confronting the Peacemaker from the DCU. So it'll be interesting to see what that dynamic is, especially with the Marvel Cinematic Universe doing the whole multiverse saga. It'll be interesting to see how the DCU does it. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of like meta references and meta humor and stuff like that, especially the fact that Peacemaker Season 1 started off in the DCEU, and Peacemaker was interacting with a lot of like DCEU characters like Batman and Wonder Woman and Superman and all the rest of the Justice League, and to see like, okay, now he's suddenly in the DCEU, and how are they going to address all that? So I'm pretty sure with the two versions of Peacemaker, colliding, I'm sure that's James Gunn's way of like addressing the fact that yes, there's a multiverse, there's different versions of these DC characters, and this season's going to explore that idea. I know this is just a teaser trailer, and I'm sure probably in the next trailer that we get closer to the release in August, we'll finally get more answers to these questions that we've been having, based on the little tag at the very end of the trailers. So we'll see what happens with that. And I definitely know there's a DC multiverse out there, especially with, Crisis on Infinite Earths, that whole comic book storyline and the whole like, Arrowverse version of it on TV. So it'll be interesting to see like how this version of the DCU explores the multiverse and all the conflicts that get brought up, as this kind of DC universe unfolds. And also, like I was saying earlier, the trailer revealed Hawkgirl, Guy Gardner, and Maxwell Lord, played by Isabella Merced, Nathan Fillion, and Sean Gunn, James Gunn's brother, who are also making their debuts in Superman. So it was really cool seeing them, seeing them at first in the Superman, and then, seeing them pop up in Peacemaker, just to show that kind of interconnectivity of the movies and the TV shows, and how James Gunn said that, no matter what medium you're in, if you're in animation, if you're in live action television, or if you're in the movie, you're going to appear as this character. So it's kind of cool seeing that continuity continuity, and the fact that everything's linear. You know, the events of Superman take place first, and then we're going to go into Peacemaker. So it's going to be interesting to see where those characters are at after the events of Superman and how they're trying to expand more of the Justice League. And, you know, because obviously there's more superheroes out there, and, you know, kind of seeing their kind of attitude toward the superheroes and seeing like who actually fits within their team and who they're just like, okay, we can write them off. So I'm definitely excited to see those characters in this series, and it's definitely a credit to James Gunn for having that kind of continuity in mind when it comes to characters appearing in different mediums within the DCU. And finally, in May of this year, it was revealed that Michael Rooker will be playing the character of Red Saint Wild, who's the world's foremost eagle hunter, who's on a mission to kill Eagly. So that's going to be really interesting to see. I know Michael Rooker has been in several James Gunn movies and TV shows, so it totally makes sense that he's going to be in this show. You know, whatever capacity might be, I'm pretty sure it's going to be like a small role that's just kind of recurring throughout the season. You know, this kind of like C storyline of Red Saint Wild going after Eagly, and I'm sure it's going to end with him about to kill Eagly, but then Peacemaker kills him instead and saves Eagly. So it's probably just going to be like a fun comedic role, maybe like kind of like a Coyote versus, you know, Roadrunner kind of situation or something, where like Red Saint Wild's like always after Eagly, but Eagly's always escaping. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. I'm still looking forward to seeing him in the series and, you know, what kind of like comedy he brings to the show. And we actually got a bunch of new updates for Peacemaker Season 2, including a brand new poster and a brand new trailer. And we'll just start off with the poster. It definitely sets the tone for what they're trying to go with this whole alternate universe that Peacemaker will be going through. And I like how the tagline is, "In what world are they the heroes?" Which definitely implies that this is going to be a better universe than the one that Peacemaker left behind. And also a bigger reference to the fact that we're leaving the DCEU and now moving into the new DCU. So I think that was really interesting. And then just moving on to the trailer, I thought it was really fun. It also kind of continues the theme that was presented in the poster of the fact that Peacemaker and Vigilante and Hardcore and Adebayo and Economos are kind of like the oddballs of the DCEU, and they're just trying to find their place in the world. And then we also get introduced to the main conflict, which is Rick Flag Sr., and the fact that he and Argus are going after Peacemaker, like I was saying earlier, due to the fact that Peacemaker killed Rick Flag Jr. in the Suicide Squad, and that Peacemaker is just trying to find an escape. And then we follow up on the storyline from the last season about the whole pocket dimension, and the fact that you can travel to parallel universes through it, which is something that was brought up in Superman. So I'm sure the season's definitely going to expand on that concept, especially the fact that Peacemaker actually goes to the other dimension and then meets all the alternate versions of his friends and family, and then realizing that this is actually a better universe for him. And it looks like he's going to battle his alternate self and try to be the replacement. But then obviously more conflict ensues when he goes back to the old universe, and he's telling Adebayo and all the other characters about this alternate universe. I'm sure they're going to bring up the fact that he can't escape his problems and he's just going to have to face them. But then Peacemaker's not going to listen, and he's going to go to the new universe. And then we get an even bigger conflict of Rick Flag Sr. and the rest of Argus figuring out that Peacemaker went to an alternate universe and continuing to pursue him. So I feel like that's going to be the main conflict that carries us throughout the entire season. And all the different characters they're going to be interacting with throughout the season. Like the fact they're going to have to work together with Judo Master, which I thought was a really funny scene when they introduced him in the trailer. So that's going to be really interesting to seeing that whole dynamic and seeing how the supporting characters are going to have to step up in order to find Peacemaker before Rick Flag does and try to resolve this whole conflict. And we'll see how this whole series goes about how they're going to stay in this new DCU continuity and open the doors for the storytelling of these new characters within this new universe. So we'll see how it goes, but this trailer definitely got me more excited for this series, and I can't wait to see what happens with it on August 21st. Also back in July of this year, James Gunn was talking about the fact that there's different universes that are explored in this season are different from the changes from the DCEU to the DCU, which is really interesting because I really thought the whole purpose of this season was to take the characters from the DCEU and then put them into the DCU. But I guess the whole continuity change will be addressed in a different way. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see if this is kind of more of like a self-contained story or if this will have bigger implications for the whole new DCU continuity. But I guess we'll have to wait and find out. Also in July this year, it was revealed that this season takes place 1 month after the events of Superman, which totally makes sense, just like I was saying earlier about how the release of the projects are kind of continuing the storyline of this new DCU. You know, the fact that we got Creature Commandos and then that kind of led into Superman, and now Superman's kind of leading into the events of Peacemaker Season 2. And I think it's interesting that it actually takes place 1 month after the actual release date of Superman. And I'm kind of curious if they're going to continue this with Lanterns and Supergirl and Clayface and all the other future DCU projects, just to continue that continuity and make it a little bit easier for audiences to follow. So we'll see how it goes with that. And then finally in July of this year, during San Diego Comic-Con, James Gunn confirmed that the song Oh Lord by Foxy Shazam would serve as a new theme song for this season, which I actually think is very interesting. You know, just listening to the song, it really has to do with themes of decision making, and I feel like that's what Peacemaker is going to be doing throughout this season, and figuring out if his decisions were wrong or right, and the consequences that can come from it. Also, the music video is kind of crazy, and I can totally see the actors trying to recreate the dance, just like they did in Season 1, so I think that would be really fun. Also, earlier this month, James Gunn and the rest of the cast attended the premiere of Peacemaker Season 2, and both James Gunn and John Cena said that this season will further the narrative of the DCU, and that there'll be a lot of guest stars and a lot of characters that we've seen from Superman appear in this season. So that's good news. It kind of confirms what I've already been saying about how important this season is when it comes to expanding the world of the new DCU. So that's really exciting, and definitely gets me more excited for this new season and see how it plays into the overall narrative of the new DCU. Also early this month, we got a brand new Red Band trailer, which definitely lives up to the title, just by the way it starts with the whole situation that Peacemaker and Vigilante are in when they're first introduced. And obviously there's a bunch of F-bombs and a bunch of ultra-violent scenes. But other than that, it definitely gives more information about the story and the fact that Rick Flag Sr. knows about the whole interdimensional device that Chris Smith has. And he also brings up that Lex Luthor had one, and we see one of the IT characters from Superman appear in this trailer. So it definitely plays on the whole interconnectivity of this new DCU and the fact that Superman definitely leads directly into this new season. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And I know we're also going to get a bunch of different comedy scenes with this whole scary alien looking creature who keeps popping in on Peacemaker. So I think that could be really good. But yeah, overall looks really fun, looks very action packed, looks obviously very violent and raunchy, but definitely kind of continues the tone from season 1 and for sure sets the tone of what we're going to see in season 2. But yeah, overall I'm really excited for Peacemaker season 2. I think it could be really fun. I think it could be really dramatic and really action packed and of course hilarious and can really give us answers about the whole transition from the DCEU into the DCU and just give us more expansion on this world that James Gunn's created. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. But overall I'm really excited and I can't wait to see it.